Welcome to Acton in Focus. I'm Vivian Kobusingye Birchall, your host, and my special guest is Mr. Tom Tidman, the Director, Natural Resources at the town of Acton. Tom?
Morning. Hi.
Hi, how are you?
Perfect. What a beautiful day.
I know, so beautiful. And what a great way to spend it with someone with so much skill, experience, and talent about our natural resources.
Well, thank you.
Maybe to our viewers, we're sitting out at the Arboretum it's a very beautiful, cozy spot for people who haven't enjoyed the Arboretum. Come on out and check it out. But today, we're just going to talk about the history of conservation in the town of Acton. For our viewers who do not know you, Tom, can you reintroduce yourself and what you do for the town of Acton?
Sure. I'm the Natural Resources Director for Acton. I have worked for the town of Acton since the late 1980s.
Wow.
I started out as the Conservation Administrator, so I did the Wetlands Protection Act side of the ledger. In the mid-90s, we were starting to talk about creating Narrow Park. It hadn't been built yet, but we were talking about it. And the need to create more energy in the recreation side of what we do. We needed to put more emphasis on management of recreation. The town manager at the time, Don Johnson, created a department called Natural Resources. So that included conservation, cemeteries, and recreation. So 3 divisions to make up one department. And I was put in charge of it. So by 1996, 97, we were in full guns with the design of Narrow Park and all the other assets that we have. So it's kind of how it happened. So I've been the director since the late 90s.
Oh my goodness, that is a lot of history, a lot of experience.
A lot of late nights.
There we go, with natural resources. So when you joined in the 1980s, what were some of the immediate needs for our natural resources for the town of Acton?
Tough question, big question. Acton had done a wonderful job of purchasing conservation land in the 1970s and early 80s. There was some state and federal money available to help towns buy land, and I think of Brewster Conant as sort of the spearhead of this, but other wonderful people as well, Pam Reeser and others, purchased a lot of beautiful land in Acton. Probably over 1,000 acres of land was owned by the 80s in Acton as conservation, with rudimentary trails throughout, but not very well managed trails that needed a lot of management and work. When I came on in 1987, there was no Arboretum yet. They had acquired the land, and they had been gifted some plant material from the Case Estates, which is part of the Arnold Arboretum. But that was one of my first tasks. I came over with Dean Charter, the Municipal Properties Director, to the main parking lot where you're parked today. And there was no parking lot. It was a little dirt parking lot. And Dean said, this is going to be one of your jobs. You need to take this old abandoned apple orchard and turn it into an arboretum.
Amazing.
So, yeah. So it was a huge task.
And when you talk about bringing in plants and all that, what was your criteria for selecting what became what we have right now in the main plants in the Arboretum?
That evolved. We first had a land management committee, but we spent all our time talking about this future Arboretum. So they quickly became the Arboretum Committee and then morphed into the Friends of the Acton Arboretum. One of their first charges was to talk about, what kinds of plants will we introduce? They really wanted it to be native to North America plants that you could plant in your own yard and have success with. Not these exotic, crazy plants that require enormous management, but plants that you could have success with in your yard. So that was sort of the thought behind it. We had a great team of people. Dr. Richard Howard, he was the retired director of the Arnold Arboretum, lived in Acton at the time. He gave us just a wealth of advice and direction when starting the Arboretum. Sandy Bain, a landscape design person. We had just a great team early on, late 90s. Harry Donahue, a local engineer who helped with the visual design of what an arboretum could be. So we had an interesting team.
So there are a couple of things you mentioned. One, that you are looking for plants that were native to New England. Were there any specific interest in plants that maybe were of significance to the native Indian tribes and people who lived here before us? And the second question is, you have mentioned a number of, names of people who were instrumental in starting the Arboretum project. About how many people were really involved to getting the Arboretum where it is today?
Boy, oh boy, that's...
Sorry, it's twofold.
Yeah. In terms of Native American influence, we've been cognizant of the Arboretum's Native American artifacts and structures from way back. We've that's always been on our mind. It's an area of Acton that's been heavily farmed over the years, so that by the 1970s, 80s, when it was the thought was to make it an arboretum, much of the property had been apple orchards.
Okay.
So old abandoned apple orchards, unmaintained apple orchards. We've tried to keep some of the apples with some success, though the apples really require a lot of maintenance and really need to be treated with insecticides and things we don't do. So the apples have decayed over time. In terms of the plant species we selected, again, we put a lot of emphasis on not so much just New England, but maybe the eastern seashore, eastern boundary of United States, North America. And again, emphasis on plants that you could plant in your yard and have success with. So we didn't want it to be so crazy that you couldn't do it in your own yard. We wanted it to be sort of an experimental garden bed that you could come and walk around and look at and say, boy, let's plant a sweet gum in our yard. They look so pretty, and maybe we'd have success. So we did exactly that.
Mm-hmm. Approximately how many plant species do we have at the Arboretum, in your estimation?
Well, I mean, we have a plant list that Dr. Howard did of the Arboretum. Several hundred would be the number. The trees, we've been introducing trees since the late 1980s all the way till now. Some we've had to replant because they didn't succeed the first time. I would bet that of the trees we planted, the tree species we planted, probably close to 100 species have come in.
Wow.
Shrubs and trees.
And then in terms of plants, animal species, how many animal species do you have? And what are some of the habitat for animals within the Arboretum?
Yeah, well, I'll start by just holding this up, Vivian. This is a little manual that was done a number of years ago, and it's really designed for school-age kids, but it gives you just a little sample of the plants and animals that you would find throughout Acton, the common species. So you're looking at plants and you're looking at rodents and mammals and some insects. And if I were to turn it over to the other side, additional birds and butterflies and moths. So for me to be able to accurately answer your question about species numbers, I would really have to do some thinking and research. But I'll tell you what, this is a handy little guide to have if you're taking the kids for a walk, because many of the bird species, animal species you would likely find will be in here.
So this is an amazing resource, Tom. Where can residents find this?
Well, you can find it through the library. You could ask Bettina Abe from my office. She knows more than I do about everything associated with where you can find resources. PIP, there's a PIP group. Have you ever heard of PIP? There's a parent group that works with students. They have them available. I think they're available at the library. Habitat is really the driver. If you have good, interesting, rich, diverse habitat, you'll get the animal species in. The Arboretum has a series of wetlands, long sort of linear wetlands that run through the property, bordering vegetated wetlands with streams, intermittent streams in them. And whenever you have that, you have all the nocturnal species that hunt and feed along stream basins. You get coyotes, fox, red fox. You get, of course, raccoons everywhere. skunks everywhere, northern skunks. You get, occasionally now we're seeing bobcats, believe it or not. Bobcats, a species that was extremely uncommon 20 years ago in this area. They're slowly migrating back in, so we're getting...
Why is that?
Just available food,
Okay.
the food that they would require, and the fact that there's good cover, good wetlands edge cover that they would hunt and move through. So they're here. Obviously deer, white-tailed deer. You would find deer in the
I
Arboretum.
haven't seen any.
They're here. We see evidence of their browsing.
Okay.
Where they nibble off the buds on our plants.
How do you tell that this is deer?
Well, you see their hoof prints
Oh,
a lot
okay.
of the time in the mud or in the sand. We get reports from people that see them crossing the streets. They're here.
And what is some of the experience that you brought into this job that enables you to be able to track the footprints of different animals, to understand the plant species, or to be aware of your environment?
Yeah, I work with environmental people. Everybody I work with has a background in, they grow up from the time they were little kids, studying plants and animals and getting to know, tracks. I grew up on a farm in Ontario, and of course all the tracks you would expect would be there of all the wild animals that we have here, plus a few more. So just life experience, just like everybody I work with. We're all nature nuts.
Right. So moving away from the Arboretum into just conservation land in general in the town of Acton, how much conservation land do we have, and what are some of the key conservation areas, or I should say not key, but what are the conservation areas we have in this town?
We have approximately 1,900 acres of conservation land, and they're divided up all over town. About a tenth of Acton's total land area is conservation. We have an area that we call Neshoba Brook, Spring Hill, that encompasses more than 400 acres in one block. So there are multiple entrances.
That's a lot of land.
That's a lot of land, and it has beautiful trails through it all. We have a land stewardship committee that does all our trail maintenance. Group of people that are dedicated to property maintenance. They have trail working days. There's a work day this past weekend at Neshoba Brook where they worked on a boardwalk repairing it. So yeah, we have and as I said, the conservation lands are spread out all over town.
What are some of the key species that can be found at the different conservation areas? Most of
the mammal species, the animal species in our conservation lands are pretty broad-based in terms of where they can survive. So they're not super narrow in terms of habitat requirements.
Okay.
So if you're a white-tailed deer, you can live in the outskirts of a city, you can live in extremely rural areas, as long as there's vegetation to feed on. Coyotes have adapted really well the same way. Coyotes can live in downtown Boston comfortably, and they do beautifully in our environment here. In terms of the plant species, we're seeing some transition over time.
Why is that?
We've had some diseases come through. There's
Okay.
a disease called ash decline that has really limited the number of white ash trees you see. If we were here 30 years ago, a lot more white ash than there are now. So and maybe we're even experiencing a tiny bit of global warming. We do have slightly warmer winters where we'll come out of hard freezes into a warm period and back into freeze. So we don't have these constant long winters anymore. There's a little transition going on.
Does that have any, what are some of the effects of that?
Hard to say right now, right? I mean, time will tell. We're seeing some more southern species of birds that are a little bit farther north now. Red-bellied woodpeckers are here commonly now. 20 years ago, you wouldn't see them very often. Carolina wrens, I heard one this morning while we were first talking, are here. Slightly more southern species that's now this far north. Some of the plants that we plant in the Arboretum probably would be more comfortable if they were, 200 miles south of where we are now. But they're doing nicely in the Arboretum. So we're seeing a little transition.
So from the 1980s, when you started working for the town to date, what have been some of the significant challenges to natural resources conservation?
Development. Acton is a lucrative town to grow up in, to live in. It's close to Boston, has a great school system. People want to move in. It's within striking distance of Boston, so you can work in Boston and raise your family in Acton. Has beautiful conservation land, has beautiful open space. So it's a very lucrative town to develop in, and we've seen development all over Acton, since the years that I've been here. We have a Wetlands Protection Act bylaw that helps protect buffer zone habitat, but development is the biggest challenge.
What can the towns and the future generations do to protect natural resources?
They can support the Open Space Committee in acquisition of open space. We buy land almost every year. We have a big long list. I should show you another little prop I have here. This is the Open Space and Recreation Plan. Okay. And in the Open Space and Recreation Plan, we have a list of properties that are privately owned but have value in terms of purchase for open space, so that they abut land we already own, or they have a unique natural history or natural environment that we would want to try to protect. And we list them in here for purchase as we go forward.
So where can people find this plan?
It's online, and I think you could talk to Bettina about it when you interview her. We're right in the beginning stages of redoing the Open Space and Recreation Plan. It's a state requirement. Every town has to have one, and ours is due this year. So we're just getting to work redoing it now.
Yeah, and I forgot to mention to our viewers that I formerly worked with the land use department. So Tom and Bettina are former colleagues, but I still get to learn a lot about natural resources every single day, because there is a lot that goes on in the background that we do not, we're not aware of as residents and even as colleagues. So during your work, what have been some of the lessons learned in terms of steps to take to conserve our environment, to protect habitat, and also to work with development, because it's going to be a part of our lives. Development has to happen, but how can it be sustainable?
Well, one of the things that Acton did that a lot of towns haven't done yet, Acton created a bylaw, a wetlands bylaw with setbacks. That means that from the edge of wetlands, there are distances certain. In Acton, the first 50 feet from the edge of wetlands is a non-buildable area. It's a natural area. So you do get to retain some natural habitat for wildlife. From the 50-foot boundary to 75 feet from wetlands, you can do landscaping or green things, but you can't have houses. So Acton essentially says that from the edge of wetlands, you have to be 75 feet away from the edge of wetlands if you want to put a structure, a building in. So we do have some built-in protection, and that's gone a long way. It's been incredibly helpful.
All right, well, let's get to the enjoyment of our natural resources. You earlier mentioned the trails that before, when you had just moved here, the trails were not really well built. What has been that journey of creating the amazing trails we have in the town of Acton, and how many of those trails are there? And how can we get to learn about them?
Well, I'll start by saying you can go online and find the trail systems for all of our conservation areas. The maps and plans look a bit like this. This is one of the Arboretum that we're sitting in today talking. So all of our trails are online and mapped, and you can get mapped little booklets. You can come to town hall or go to the library. Little books that look like this. List all of our major conservation trails and lands with a little description of each, so those are hugely handy. In the 1980s when I started, there were trails. There were trails on the conservation lands, many of which were pretty rough and required boardwalks and improvements to really get the public in, even some signage and little parking lots to let people know where they were. So we worked on that for a number of years. Then we thought, well, we have a really interesting volunteer base that are helping. Maybe we should organize them a little more, and we did. We called it the Land Stewardship Committee. Yeah. It's a subcommittee of the Conservation Commission, and there's a land steward assigned to each of the major properties. They have monthly meetings. Bettina runs the meetings, and they talk about projects they're working on, things they found. If a tree comes down on a big conservation land over a trail, There are people that are assigned that'll go and cut that tree up and open the trails back up. So much has happened since the early 1990s in terms of trail maintenance, and it's largely due to the Land Stewardship Committee.
Right. And so what has been your observation in terms of people using these trails over the years? Has there been an increased interest in using the trails, decreased? What has been the trend?
I think Acton's trails are quite heavily used. I don't know how that compares to other towns because I don't see their trails all that frequently. We have parking lots at many of our conservation lands. As I said, we have a trail guide system. I'll tell you one thing, during the time when people were at home with the COVID crisis, our trail uses, our parking lots were full every day.
Oh, my goodness.
So and people needed to get out just to do something that was fun and not stuck inside.
And not near many people.
Yeah, not near so many people.
All right. And speaking of, you talked about the signages at these trails and natural resources. So I noticed as I picked up some of this literature over the years that there's a lot of illustrations by you. So what is your history with the illustrations, and what inspired you to use that gift to help us, contribute to literature that is used by residents and towns?
Well, I think that a lot of the booklets and pamphlets we had just needed something. They needed something that was a little more visual, right? I mean, it's nice to have a picture mixed in with all the information. And any of the drawings, this is a screech owl that I did, the drawings that I've added into these books are often of animals or birds that you might see in the conservation land that you're on. I just noticed one of the Arboretum that we did I did a lot of years ago now. It just showed part of the trail system that we worked on, a little rolling kind of hillside. In terms of education, I think if you can draw, you can draw. It's just one of those things that you can do. So ever since I was a little kid, I drew. I draw things, and it came in handy. I mean, even in this. This little booklet about the streams and protecting streams in Acton. We obviously have great blue herons and everywhere in town on all our streams. So I illustrated it with a great blue heron near a stream.
I mean, this is perfect work. How do you study the different animals and illustrations? Before you put them down, and how long does it take for you to complete an illustration? Just curious. Well, this is intense.
It depends. It depends on how big the drawing is and on what someone's asking me to do. A drawing of a screech owl that we talked about earlier, it would take maybe 3 hours to do something like that.
Wow.
And I wouldn't do it all at once. I would get bored with it and come back to it. It's one of those things that I would pick away at. I think if you can draw, you can sort of visualize, in 3 dimension. You can see what something looks like, and as a nature nut like all of us, I spent a lot of my life, outside, so I know where they live and how they act, and these species that I've drawn over the years.
Are you going to author a book illustrated by you on nature someday? And do you have one that we don't even know about?
No, you don't. There isn't one. I don't think I will. But you never know. I mean, if someone asked me to do some illustrations, I've done many illustrations over the years.
So all right, now that's an open invitation. I'm going to ask you to help us with an illustration for our children, because I think my kids would benefit from something like that.
No, I don't know. It's not very kid friendly. It's kind of more realistic. Although I guess
that's what we want.
Okay.
We want realistic.
Oh.
But anyway, back to the protection of wetlands. What is some advice you can give to us as residents and as local governments in terms of strategies for protecting our wetlands and other natural resources?
Two big questions.
Yes.
With respect to wetlands, I would start by saying that it's all about protecting water. Mm-hmm. And we have this finite resource that is our drinking water supply. Yeah. So anything and everything we can do to protect our water resource, we have to do. So anytime that you can create buffers around wetlands, they're natural sponges. They're natural areas where contaminants, nutrients can be removed from water. Buffer zones are critically important. They're also extremely important for wildlife habitat, as we talked about earlier. These corridors that are wetlands buffer zones through these through these wildlife areas, conservation lands in this case, Arboretum here, are travel corridors. That's where wildlife lives. It's where the wildlife travels. It's where wildlife feeds. So you really have to keep this natural diversity of habitat. You're lucky in Acton to have an open space committee. The open space committee purchase land as often as they can, so they do a wonderful job of protecting open space. Acton Water District does a fantastic job of buying land when they can to protect resources around their wells. Conservation Commission works tirelessly. They have long night meetings twice each month, pushing back a little bit on some of the extreme, development schemes that are out there, trying to keep some more open space, create bigger buffers that ultimately protect your water resources.
We have one Superfund site in Acton, the W.R. Grace, and it had an impact on the quality of water. And I think that's one of the reasons that our water keeps, they have to keep monitoring it. Did it have any adverse effects that you know of on our, other natural resources other than water?
The land that is now has been W.R. Grace for many, many years, essentially the buildings have now been removed. There are still some paved surfaces, so it has some impact on the landscape. A lot of work has been done over the years to improve the W.R. Grace site. There's a pond called Sinking Pond on W.R. Grace site that's much improved. They've, an awful lot of energy and work and expertise has gone into containing and removing all of many of the chemicals that were in the groundwater, are in the groundwater. They're putting some solar panels fields on some of the Grace site, so some energy will be generated on the Grace site. So little by little it's improving, but it's a long, slow process.
What can the different industries that we have in our towns do to make sure that they do not pollute our environment and protect our natural resources? Because like I mentioned earlier, I don't know whether you actually got into it, but how do we coexist with development?
Again, a big long question, big long answer. I would say that little by little we're going more solar. We're heading in that direction, which is hugely important. Bettina will probably touch on that too when you interview her. We're finding that there's better stormwater control, so stormwater control of parking lots and roof runoff from these impervious surfaces, from these industrial areas, through bioretention areas and through rain gardens. So we're getting some nutrient removal. So I think many of the industrial sites or the commercial sites in Acton are cognizant of this and aware and making improvements. Right.
Speaking of construction sites, from your experience, what has been some of the challenges to contractors who want to come and put up developments? What do you look for when you're reviewing these plans as a natural resources director? And what has been some of the trends?
Well, all the larger developers in the Acton area understand that we all have bylaws, each department. The planning department is very organized in Acton. We have, as you know, a wetlands bylaw. So the developers that develop in Acton are aware of that, they're cognizant of that, and they typically hire engineers that are in the area, local engineers, and they know the laws thoroughly too. So in terms of how we would start, often my first interaction with a developer on a site is with their engineer walking the property. Before construction ever even is contemplated. They identify where the wetlands resources are. They have them all identified and staked, and they file under the Wetlands Protection Act so that's all nailed down before anything ever starts. Then they go through a long process, often working with the land use department. We have meetings, preliminary meetings. talking about what their plan is. I'm just looking over at some bluebirds that have come in as we speak. So.
Bluebirds distracting Tom. Oh my God, it's so beautiful.
Yeah. Well, you know what? I'll tell you what. 25 years ago or so, when I had been here just a short time, you seldom saw a bluebird.
Oh, really?
You'd be lucky if you ever saw one in Acton. We, for years and years, put up bluebird boxes all over town in the correct habitat. We had elementary school kids build the boxes.
Oh, nice.
So we have them on all of our conservation lands, the boxes. We have them on a lot of private properties. And we now have a healthy bluebird population. Oh. Thanks to a lot of people that do a lot of hard work maintaining the boxes and cleaning them and, things that go along with it. So yeah. I'm distracted by that. But that is a really good example of things that we could do to actually help nature a little bit. And we had success.
Excellent. So please describe the process for creating a specific conservation area.
Okay.
How does the process start, or what triggers the process, and how does it get finalized?
I'm going to give you an example.
Okay.
I think that's the only way I can answer this one, because it's a big kind of lengthy explanation. We have some land off of Arlington Street that we call the Bewlett Conservation Area. And it abuts a little bit of land that's a little chunk of town forest land over there. So we have been watching all of the properties around that and had them listed in our open space and recreation plan, saying that, boy, oh boy, if these ever come on the market, we've got to try to buy these.
So you're always watching?
We always watch.
Okay.
And the open space committee were very aware of these properties too. Well, lo and behold, 10 years ago, one of these blocks of land that we called the Anderson parcel came on the market. The people of Acton stepped up and purchased 20 acres of beautiful conservation land. So now this land is starting to take form. We had some frontage on Arlington Street, 20 acres of fabulous land called the Anderson parcel that abuts or almost abutted some of the other land that we already own, the Bewlett land. Then this development that's occurring right now called 180 Newtown Road. The Horinowitz family are developing 8 lots at 180 Newtown Road. Yep. They are gifting the town of Acton, working through the planning board and the Conservation Commission, the back portion of that property at 180 Newtown Road that happens to abut directly with the Arlington Street parcel called Anderson.
Yeah, I sat in those meetings, the hearings.
Yes. So now we have this fabulous stepping stone series of parcels that all blend together to make this big, very functional conservation land. So in terms of how do you make a conservation land, it takes a lot of hard work and patience. It doesn't happen quickly. The developer of 180 Newtown Road is also going to put a small parking lot over on the Anderson parcel for us, and they're going to build a boardwalk across Grassy Pond Brook so that the Anderson parcel, so anyone next year will be able to park at that parking lot, come through the Anderson parcel, cross the boardwalk that's at the Grassy Pond Brook crossing, through this land into the Bewlett land. So it's just a really sort of interesting mix. To get back to your original question, the planning board, working with the Conservation Commission, working with the Open Space Committee, working with the Land Use Department, working with natural resources in a big way on a day-to-day basis. That's how you build these things. Then you have this group called the Land Stewardship Committee maintain it. So it's a win-win-win-win, multi-win thing. And you have to have a developer willing to work with you in many cases, and or you have to have landowners willing to sell their property at a price that we can afford.
This is excellent, Tom. Is there anything that I haven't asked about natural resources and your history with natural resources for how many years since 1987? That's a long time.
Yes, that's a long time.
And I know I can't encompass all your experience in just 1 hour's interview, but is there anything that is of significance that you would want the future generation to know and learn about this whole process?
Patience. You have to take your time with all of these projects. None of them are quick and in easy fixes. Acton is a unique town. It's full of amazing volunteers. We've been able to draw on volunteers for every single aspect of what we've done. the level of expertise in Acton in terms of scientists that I've worked with, or skilled carpenters, or someone like Bettina Abe, who runs the Arboretum volunteers and works with the Land Stewardship Committee. The work that volunteers get done is just amazing.
So with that, I want to say thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me. And hopefully, maybe there might be another opportunity before you retire, but if there isn't, this is somewhere to start. And I might pull you out of your retirement if I have a question, so you're not off the hook.
You can try.
But yeah, with this, thank you so much for the work you have done for the town of Acton over the so many years. It was a pleasure working with you in the land use department. It's a pleasure being here with you, learning about some of this journey. And I wish you the very best.
Thank you.
In whatever you decide to do with life, and hopefully we can still come back to you for some consultation.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
And now I am with Bettina Abe from the Natural Resources Department. I mean, Tom has mentioned her name multiple times. Bettina, welcome to the show.
Did he say anything bad about me?
Yes, all bad things except for one thing. And he says all truthful. So anyway, no, he said amazing things about you, that you know a lot of things. You have all the experience about the species that we have in the Arboretum and on our conservation land in Acton. So what can you tell us about the species, plants, animals, and I see you have a brochure for Vanderpool.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Oh my goodness, we have so many animals here at the Arboretum, and whatever we have here, we have on the other conservation lands too. Okay. And we have some neighbors who have wildlife cameras, and they send us pictures. So there's, you know, everything that you might expect and not expect. I mean, there are bobcat, coyote, deer, those are the large mammals. We have not seen a bear in the Arboretum or gotten a picture of a bear yet.
Okay.
Down in my neighborhood in South Acton, we have, like walking down School Street, there have been bears, but not in the Arboretum yet. And then there's like the smaller sized mammals. You've got the woodchucks, skunks, possum, bunnies. We have an area up there that we call Bunny Alley because they've got two clumps of very overgrown shrubbery and such that they can dart in and out of. They can come out and eat the grass, and they can eat all the apples that fall from the apple trees. Then they can jump back into the bushes and hide. They can get raspberries, blackberries, blueberries, all kinds of food for the bunnies.
Speaking of, I have two questions. One, you spoke of apples, and I know that there are some apple trees within the Arboretum. Can residents eat those apples?
Well, everyone asks us that, and like technically on conservation land, we like to say leave no trace, which means take nothing, leave nothing. But the Arboretum being an apple orchard, you know, people think if the apples are falling on the ground, it's wasted. Well, yeah. It's really not, because you know, there's nothing wasted in nature. It can compost and feed the grass, but there are so many critters who eat it when we go home at the end of the day. But absolutely, if you pick up an apple that just landed on the ground, rub it on your shirt, it's delicious. But we ask people not to climb the trees and not to take like big rakes or tools and pull the apples off the trees.
Wow. And then you also talked about the different plants, mammals that are in the Arboretum and other conservation land. So how much work does it take to protect the habitat for these animals?
We try to teach folks, like we have a wildlife pond up the trail over there, and there's a lot of turtles and frogs in there, and sometimes we see families come with nets. And so we put up a little sign that says, protect our wildlife, just because it is a form of harassment to capture a wild animal, even if, you know, you think, oh, we're learning about this animal. We prefer leave no trace, just bring some binoculars, let them live in peace. And that, you know, that can be something that we have to remind people. And the same with a butterfly net. Like, there's a lot of butterflies that have a very hard time finding habitat, and the last thing that we want someone to do is catch them in a net and hurt them. But we have also a lot of raptors like owls and hawks, and they will eat those small mammals that hide in the stone walls and stuff like that.
Approximately how many plant species do we have in the Arboretum?
Oh, wow.
Or even the animal species?
I know that Tom talked a lot about native plant species, and we do plant a fair amount of those, but since it's an arboretum, we also have collected species that originate on the far side of the world as well, especially Western China, Japan, Korea.
Is there a reason for that?
Yes, they have the very similar climate.
Okay.
So like the azaleas and the rhododendrons, we have lots of those, and viburnums, and we have paperbark maple from China, and Japanese maples, a few, but so many diverse species. I'd say there must be like 2,000.
So what strategies do you have in place to make sure that some of the species that are foreign do not become invasive species?
There are lists. There's something called IPANE, I-P-A-N-E, and that's sort of an index. I think it's the University of Connecticut, and certain species get added to that list, and then nurseries can no longer sell them. So they were originally imported, and everyone thought they were so beautiful, and they bought them, and then over time we realized they escaped and populated the whole understory, and stuff like burning bush and barberry, some other things like scientists would bring over and thought would be lovely in their little fish ponds, and those escaped and now pollute our waterways.
Are there any bylaws that protect the environment from invasive species from being introduced?
There really aren't, because there are federal and state laws instead that take care of that.
Okay. Well, is there anything else you'd like our viewers to know about the conservation efforts in the town of Acton?
Definitely.
Your history. First of all, I forgot to ask you to introduce yourself to the viewers. Tell them what exactly you do for our Natural Resources Department, how long you've lived here, and maybe some advice on what they can do to protect our natural resources.
Oh, sure. My family and I moved here 25 years ago. I can't believe it's been that long. And it took Tom a couple of years to get my job created. It takes a while to figure out how you're going to define a job position and then find the funding to allocate it. You have to justify that that position is needed. And I've been a natural resources assistant, to Tom for about 10 years. So he hired me to, sort of help do the things that he no longer had time to do. His job had grown so much over the decades. So I do things like recruit volunteers to pick water chestnuts off of Neshoba Brook that were choking it. I work a lot with volunteers, and people would be very interested to know how many volunteers assist with the Arboretum. We have a small army of folks that do everything, all the fine gardening. We have our natural resources crew, who are paid employees who do a ton for us as well, like the lawn mowing and like heavy equipment. They can pour bridge footings for us and stuff for some of our boardwalks. But all of our trails, like Tom was saying, we have amazing land stewards and amazing community volunteers.
So Tom is going to retire soon. So what is some of the key things, lessons you've learned, or best practices you've learned from Tom that you think could be applied by future generations to protect and preserve our natural resources?
Wow, I've learned so much on the job from Tom and all the other conservation collaborators in this town and in the greater community, like in our watershed. We have the Sudbury Assabet Concord or Suasco watershed. We have ORS for the Organization for the Assabet Concord and Sudbury River, Sudbury Valley Trustees, Acton Conservation Trust, all these people who know wildlife and plants and ecosystems, and working with Tom, who pulled me in, and just working closely affiliated with him and the Conservation Commission. I've just learned so much. I can't even begin to tell you.
Well, thank you, Bettina. Thank you for sharing your knowledge natural resources with us.
My pleasure.
And I hope to be speaking with you more about our natural resources in the future.
I'm very happy to do so.
And again, thank you for watching us at Acton Podcast. I'm Vivian Birchall, your host. Till next time.
Bye.